Welcome back to Neutrality Studies. I'm Pascal Lotta, an associate professor at Kyoto University, and today I've got with me Greg Mellow, a co-founder of the Los Alamos Study Group, where he has been a researcher and activist on the nuclear and other issues for the past 35 years. Greg, welcome.
So glad to be here. Thank you, Pascal.
I'm really glad you said yes. We are connected through our mutual friends who are all working in this nuclear space, including Ivana Hughes and other people within the academic world. So could you maybe give me a little bit of background of how it came that you became a anti-nuclear activist and researcher in Los Alamos?
Well, of course, it began with childhood drills. I also lived in Livermore, California. We were building. My father was building parts of the early parts of Livermore Lab, and this was my world. And I went on to be an engineer and city planner. I'll settled as to what exactly I should do. I was a environmental engineer for the state and the first enforcement official at Los Alamos National Laboratory, while also being a interfaith nuclear activist in Santa Fe, New Mexico in the 80s. And then that was insufficiently committed, I felt. So gathered friends, and we decided that at the end of the Cold War, that possibly if we tried a little harder, we could nudge some of these institutions toward a more peaceful future, away from their previous commitments. And hence we founded the Los Alamos Study Group. And we found that, and I started working full time, renting out my house so I could live in the office. And we found it was easier than we imagined at first. The nuclear weapons establishment of the United States was kind of in free fall. And we pushed here, we pushed there. I was an enforcement official for the state and knew something about the legal system, and used those skills together with the technical background to be a pain in the neck for the Los Alamos National Laboratory. And they began to take us quite seriously. And at the same time, joining with our elder brothers and sisters who had been in the fight elsewhere in the Bay Area, all around the country, and began internationally being active at the United Nations in between our U.S. work. And so it went for many years, and we were attempted to go back to academia, but we did not. And we found after this is, I think, an important thing, after a very discouraging time in the aughts, when things seemed to be going very south under George
W. Bush.
Walker Bush. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or Cheney, whichever. We discovered that we had many friends in Washington, D.C. after all these years, and that we were taken quite seriously in the halls of power at that time. And so we were able to stop a factory for the weapon cores made of plutonium that are at the heart of nuclear weapons in 2011, 2012. And that has set back the U.S. rearmament agenda.
Mm.
Now we're in one of these periods where it's not uniformly encouraging, you might say.
It's a very diplomatic way of expressing it, but I'm glad you're not taking us down the pessimist route. Not uniformly
encouraging.
not uniformly encouraging. Okay, yeah, that I like that. It's not uniformly encouraging, but you're saying like it hasn't. There have been other times when things haven't been uniformly encouraging.
Correct. What Trump is doing in his clumsy gangster-like style is at bottom not greatly different than what we have seen in previous administrations, and indeed reflects a foreign policy drift that has been in place in the United States for a very long time. So it's not all
Right.
that.
So it's not that different, but if you look at these ups and downs, and actually we were connected through Steven Starr, who's on my channel and made a beautiful expose on what it would mean if there was an actual nuclear war. We've talked about this quite a bit. I mean, we know all of this, and you've written also for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. The atomic age is now more than 80 years old, right? And atomic technology or knowledge about it is now about 100 years old. And we are now, after 100 years of researching all of this and creating all of these bombs and stuff, living in a world without nuclear safety treaties. I mean, nuclear weapons treaties between Russia and the United States, because the New START treaty was just the United States let it lapse. I mean, it was the US, because the Russians said, like, let's do it, please, let's continue with this important framework. Not all the frameworks are gone. We still have the non-proliferation treaty. We still have some multilateral treaties, but the big nuclear weapons safeguards are gone. So if you had to compare this to any point previously in this 100-year history, where do you think we are at the moment? Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below, and now back to the video.
The U.S. is in a different position today than it was at any time prior. There's no sense of heroism or ultra patriotism in working for the nuclear weapons complex. We are not in the values environment of the early Cold War. And as a result of the productivity, the focus, and unquestioned loyalty of people working on weapons of mass destruction in the United States can't be counted on in the same way. And across the entire complex for warheads, and also in the Department of Defense, there isn't really a rah-rah attitude, and they are having trouble with that. I would exaggerate that, but it's not stable in the same way it was. And it's also very inefficient. So making nuclear weapons is an industry. It was very large. It cannot be sourced internally from a robust, highly skilled industrial workforce the same as it could be in the 1960s. The environmental and worker safety aspects of this industry can no longer be taken for granted. In high school, I lived near a Minuteman III and other missile factory, which grossly polluted the environment, and that just couldn't happen again. And so the costs go up, and the complexity creates problems for the execution of these projects. The way we structure this in the United States, with many for-profit companies forming a network, a hierarchy as well as a horizontal network, creates enormous inefficiencies and the need for coordination. So for a large project like the plutonium warhead core factory in South Carolina, where capital costs have ballooned to somewhere between 18 and $25 billion, they are struggling to get that is, the Fluor Corporation is struggling to get its arms around the complexity of this project. And maybe they've succeeded, well, maybe not. The Trump administration wants them out, we hear. And so there'll be most likely a change of contractor. But this pattern is replicated across the Warhead complex, certainly not on that scale, but the business of building, let's say, plutonium warhead cores, the acquisition cost is now, the total acquisition cost of this current plans is now about $50 billion. $50 billion is more than even this country can absorb. And a lot of the people, for one part of a warhead.
For one part of a warhead, $50 billion for one part of a warhead, of which then needs to go through other stages in order to create the entire weapon.
That is correct. And that's just to acquire the factories. That is not the actual production.
And we just need to put this into context, because Donald Trump just announced that this year's defense budget would be 1.5 trillion. But even 1.5 trillion, 50 billion is, that's a tenth of half a trillion, right? So that would be a third of the budget. So if you say like 50 billion is only the start, then we're talking about something that even for the United States is going to eat up huge chunks of the defense budget, even that ridiculously large budget.
Yes, assuming that he gets that. And he may. But there's plenty of hurdles between now and passage of such a gigantic, unprecedented budget. It's not just the quantity, it's also the jump.
Right.
So the U.S. is in a peculiar position where a relatively small group of people believes that the United States is and can be stronger both internally and externally than it actually is. So I just came from a meeting of nuclear weapons executives in government and industry, and there's very much a can-do attitude, and it's a new attitude. It's a very aggressive, militaristic attitude. But at the same time, there's an element of whistling past the graveyard. This is a message which is being socialized among the big defense contractors. Yes, we can do this. We can produce on an accelerated scale based on we can decrease the time necessary to design and produce nuclear warheads by a factor of 2 or 3. We can do all these many things, and whether they actually can is another question. At the same time, there's an overestimation of the relative U.S. power in the world, a denial that the world system has actually changed, and we can't just, be the bully.
Isn't that, I mean, what you're saying here would speak in favor of, like, the Trump trying to extend the New START treaty? Or is it, in your estimate, is this U.S. leadership and the military industrial complex in a moment of delusion, self-delusion about capacity? Because apparently, I mean, if you're right, then something has seriously changed. this capacity is not there anymore, and because of the regulatory frameworks, and maybe also, I mean, is it a lack of knowledge? Is it a forgetting? Is it a what is it that keeps the industry from reaching the heights that it had, like probably around the 1980s?
Mhm. It's structural. Um, the it's the oh the large number of companies involved. It's not a nationalized business.
Mhm.
So nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads, let's say, are over 95% privatized. And
95. Wow.
yes, you would think this is a federal responsibility, but there's really only a few federal people. And so at Los Alamos, for example, which is the largest site for warheads, there's eh, varies. This is a strange thing. They have 14,000, or maybe it's 18 or 19,000 employees, depending on the day of the week. And uh, but of those, about 90 are well, and separately, there's about 90 federal employees, and so those 90 are represent the federal government at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And it's not really enough. It's not the model of the Manhattan Project, where it was about half military and half University of California
Mm.
employees. So now we have we have these for-profit entities, and they themselves have many subcontractors. Within the federal side, there are many subcontractors as well, which have captured a lot of the experience. And so every time someone who knows a lot retires, they get sucked up by one of these consulting firms, and which have really policy-making roles in the federal government. Um, so anyway, it's not. I was There was a very intelligent admiral who is the number two in the warhead business, Admiral Papineau. He was head of Navy Strategic Systems, which would be the nuclear weapons part of the Navy. But I wanted to tell him at this conference, like shout it out, uh, that the National Nuclear Security Administration, that is the civilian side of nuclear warheads, is not the Navy. It's not the Navy. And he is now running a large herd of cats. And it's a different model than in Russia. And it's, I assume, everywhere. But here we are,
I mean,
private industry.
I'm kind of happy to hear that. I mean, you're saying like, no, the United States is dreaming in terms of like what it can do and what it wants to do. I think that's a hopeful thought, but doesn't that mean that the political process is utterly misunderstanding its own? I mean, its own realities on the ground. And what does that mean for the future of the international environment? I mean, the Russians are, I don't know what the Russians are going to do now. I mean, they seem to have an interest in not having this escalate. The Chinese seem to have an interest in like getting their nuclear warheads to a more comparable level. On the other hand, they already have several hundreds of them. I mean, probably maybe enough, to do this kind of stupid math situation, right? That everybody seems to be calculating. What do you think is going to happen now?
Well, it depends. And I don't want to paint too optimistic a picture.
Hmm.
I'm pointing out these problems because they've been there for 3 decades, and the Trump administration wants to turn this around on a dime, and they will try very hard. They are loosening safety regulations, loosening environmental regulations, and construction regulations, uh, nuclear material accountability regulations, the human reliability regulations. All of this is being done to get past the red tape, which has held back U.S. nuclear weapon design and production.
Mm.
They will, to some extent, succeed. But to what extent depends, and this is directed to your question, on the political environment, on the competition for skilled labor in the United States, on the pushback from other countries, on the overall economic situation and fiscal situation of the country. So the Pentagon can be very jealous of its money. If they don't get that extra 500 billion, there's going to be a scramble because the Pentagon, well, the nuclear submarines, bombers, missiles are also over budget and delayed. And especially the missiles, the land-based missiles. And they've had to really retrench their plans for new ICBMs. Again, because of the loss of tacit knowledge, it's really a technical and managerial problem. They didn't realize that all of the silos have to be actually replaced rather than just remodeled. And again, there was this can-do attitude that, taken to extremes, results in a technical optimism that has dogged all these programs for quite a while. So what will happen is anybody's guess, but the ability of the United States to have an arms race is constrained by really large forces. The bigger the program, the larger the problem.
You're kind of making my day here. Thank you. It's one of the most positive news of 2026 so far on my channel. But because, like, I mean, running into technical and structural issues, problems for weapons manufacturing is much better than policy, because policy can be turned around very quickly. What do you? There was something on my mind that I just wanted to ask, and now it slipped. It had to do with this with the programs that were run in the past, and what it takes to produce these things, these doomsday weapons. And maybe if you compare the model to like what the Chinese are doing, is this from your research? Do you know how these production lines differ? Oh, and yes, now it's back. If the Chinese actually go back and switch off this rare earth delivery to the United States, because this seems to be a real Achilles heel. If the Chinese actually said, like, you know what, even with tariffs, whatever, no more rare earths for you guys, how devastating would that be on the nuclear arms production lines?
I'm afraid I can't answer that question because I am not sure. And but wouldn't be good. It is difficult. There's been a scramble to source everything in the most stable way. Usually it's more pedestrian, the problems.
Pedestrian.
Yes. In COVID, during COVID, or shortly thereafter, one construction manager gave a speech. I heard that the nuclear weapons facility. And he said, I woke up one morning and my crew said there is no plywood to be obtained anywhere near us. And so everything stops on the construction project. The plywood.
That sounds pedestrian for a problem, yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So there haven't been enough electricians in Eastern Tennessee to finish the new uranium processing facility on time. So we have a skilled labor problem. At the Pantex nuclear weapons assembly plant, where all U.S. nuclear weapons are assembled, recently there was one day when the plant lost 60 blue-collar craftsmen in one day because they went to work for higher pay at a AI data center, which is under construction right across the street. And at Los Alamos, there is a comparable problem because the oil companies in the Permian Basin can pay more than Los Alamos National Laboratory. And so they have lost construction workers, plumbers, electricians. A senior person in a government auditing agency, in a meeting we had with him on Zoom on Friday, said that AI data centers, in their struggle to hire electricians, are now paying $500,000 a year salary for electricians.
That's a good salary.
It's a very good salary.
So,
And
love it. Okay.
yes, at Los Alamos, it's difficult to hire people to have a career of working in a completely hermetically sealed, dark, prison-like plutonium facility with your hands awkwardly in glove boxes, with the potential of exposure, personal exposure. And even if you are a brave person, your spouse may not like this job for you. And there are ergonomic issues that result in orthopedic problems. And so there's a cash bonus for people who do this. So now, if you have enough experience with a bachelor's degree, you can make $400,000 a year working at the Los Alamos plutonium facility making pits. But they have found that it's necessary to have this salary flexibility in order to keep their workforce. So Los Alamos was bleeding 800 or 900 people per year out of their workforce. And whether they have fully staunched this, well, not fully, but they have substantially staunched this. But at this point in time, the Trump administration is really the most opaque administration we've ever seen. So we don't have an update on that number. I guess I could have asked that question a couple weeks ago, but I didn't.
I mean, again, glad to hear that. How can we compound on that problem for the for that industry? I mean, how do we keep fanning the flames of that problem? Because I guess that's a way forward, right? Informing people that they can get better jobs in a civilian capacity where they don't have to be in danger and earn more and just brain drain that horrible industry.
Yes. Well, I think that there's a gigantic role for citizens who are people of conscience and who want to develop their interpersonal skills and who know about this issue, want to talk to people.
Mm.
There, we know lots of people in this industry. In fact, some of our family members are in this industry. And they are, interestingly, people who have a lot of, let's say, external control or accountability, that's the word, in their work life, very often are high integrity people in some ways. So, you meet these people in the military. They are straight shooters because the environment is one where if you are not a straight shooter, people find that out very quickly, and you either wash out or get straight.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so I guess I'm saying something that one of our fellow activists said to me last week. We know we're not better than them. We know we're not better people, but we are sorry that they are caught up in this industry, which, they're, but for the grace of God. Uh, so, I mean, my college roommate, I thought we had a deal going where neither of us would work in the weapons industry, but he took the job at Livermore uh, Laboratory, and bless his heart, and which was a little bit of a heartbreak. And so the uh, people have consciences. Everybody does.
Mhm.
And so we have to have these conversations, and present ourselves in the marketplace of ideas. Hibakusha have been very important, but
Mhm.
um, it's a matter of face-to-face interactions, of writing, and the fact that uh, Trump and his people have taken the veil off is a advantage.
Mm.
So, I mean, not just in the narrative, but also um, in practice. So, many of our good Democratic Party friends, or let's say centrist people, thought that the New START treaty was keeping us safe. And we've been telling people forever that we aren't safe, that this is not a situation which is under control.
Even with New
The Europe,
Start.
yes, with New START, even with ABM treaty, with INF, I mean, these are very important. And I wouldn't for one second discount their importance. But underneath that, the dynamic has persisted. And it really started um, in 1995 with the rejection of binding disarmament requirements
Mm.
in the NPT.
Right.
That was the moment. And then the second Clinton administration began to slowly implement a let's say a rebound from the disarmament orientation that uh, was in place the first part of the 1990s. So at the Los Alamos Study Group, everything was easy. In the early 90s, got harder and harder. And because, they could say, we're back.
Mm.
Um, and we, the old goal of being the big dog in the world hadn't gone away. The nuclear weapons strapped to the belt of the Teddy Roosevelt's figure bestriding the world. Um, this never went away. And the true believers dug in, and uh, neocons inhabit the upper reaches of the U.S. government in both administrations, both kinds. I mean,
Right, right. Uh, However, I mean, on the one hand, we have the regulatory issue. On the other hand, we have the capacity issue. And the capacity issue, you already said, look, there's a lot of things that are not going the way that the warmongers would like to have it. And luckily, it seems they didn't really notice that yet. Or even if they did, they'd have no better idea but throwing a lot of money at it. Um, what would in one of my books that I edited, we wrote about the non-proliferation treaty and the European neutrals, and in the introduction I wrote, look, the nuclear knowledge, we cannot unknow it, we cannot unlearn nukes, but we can try to figure out ways to deal with these doomsday weapons, right, in a way that they don't go off. now we've lost a good part of the regulations that we created, right? And they came out of the Cold War, actually. What if those were revived, if there was a second approach at trying to do nuclear arms control, in your view, where would one have to start these days for a new start?
Mhm. Um, we have to start with a modus vivendi with Russia and China.
Mm.
So, uh, in a way, you could say that we had assumptions of peace in the early post-Cold War period. It was an unbalanced peace, but it was a kind of a peace. We Today we don't have that. There's no mutual secure guarantee or assumption of mutual security.
Hmm.
In fact, the opposite. And so we have to start, since most of the nuclear weapons, not quite 90%, are in the US and Russia. Um, we have to start there, and we have to start with Ukraine and with um, the issue of Russian security in its near abroad, whether that be in Central Asia or uh, in Eastern Europe, and uh, and all the way from the Arctic Circle all the way down. Uh, and NATO spends a lot of money, although it's fragmented and ineffective, on weapons. And now we have the situation where uh, Europe is very belligerent, um, and the United States continues to negotiate rather faithlessly. And on the one hand, the idea of strategic defeat of Russia, the Russian Federation, remains the most, I think, under it all, the most powerful belief in U.S. foreign policy circles as regard Russia. And on the other hand, there's another, at least for public and Russian consumption, the idea that we want to make nice and have business deals, maybe, and but all of this has come to a head in Ukraine, of course, and it is we have to stabilize our relationship with Russia and acknowledge that we need mutual security. Russia is not going to enter into any arms control or disarmament treaties for some time now, because I think the Ukraine war and the expansion of NATO, the sanctions, the attacks deep within Russia have its own strategic deterrent, Putin's residence, so forth. All of this has entered now deeply into the Russian um, psyche and foreign policy elite, and it can't be changed quickly. So we have to work on this we're back, way back now. In this regard, we're back to the 60s, early 60s.
Yeah, it's a very, very sad moment, but you've been in this space for so long. I mean, who are the primary instigators of this absolutely foolish approach? Is it just the neocons, or are there like the carrierists? Are there like which groups are the ones that in your view are responsible, especially also for this escalation in the nuclear realm?
Yes. Well, of course, it's a system, and uh, it, um, it the neocons are. I mean, we have a saying in this country: no matter who you vote for, you always get John McCain. Uh,
Right. Sad. The
yeah.
guy's gone, but yeah, he's
Yes.
he's very much alive in the heads of so many of these
Yes.
people. Yeah.
Yes. And his staff, former staff, are in the Pentagon. and in high levels, and they mentor others. The nuclear laboratories, make a point of putting their people in high positions, whether as a permanent career change or change of station assignment that might last a year or two. So we have a system of private donations for political campaigns,
Right.
and that's very powerful. And in some places like this state, there is an ideology that we have to depend on nuclear weapons for our basic economic existence. So our congressional delegation from New Mexico is reliably loyal to nuclear weapons institutions and funding, and they choose committee assignments accordingly, and so do other places. South Carolina, in California, liberal California, so-called, there are 52 Congress people, and none of them will question the mission of Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, which designs nuclear weapons. And there's a lot of our opposition in Congress is largely performative at this point. They're on the take. And so even if Trump wanted to, he says these things from time to time. He doesn't like nuclear weapons. And even if he wanted to do something, he needs the votes of his Republican counterparts in the Senate. And that has in the past, in his first term, that was very powerful in constraining and guiding what he did. And then on the other side, we had this Russiagate and everything associated with it, which constrained him from the other side of the aisle, even if he wanted to do something, which there was no evidence of in the first place. Not strong evidence anyway. So it's a combination of people on the inside, people on the outside, and an enormous amount of effort is made to craft the narratives which keep all of these parties happy and employed. All of the senior people in the nuclear weapons business, the warhead business, let's say, have a nuclear weapons background, often military. And so no one is confirmed for the head of these jobs these days if they don't have a long ideological record of loyalty. So it's hard to point to a single individual. It's a long-standing set of beliefs and entrenched institutions. I think we can say that since you're in Kyoto, that as James Douglas has pointed out in his recent book on the assassinations that plagued us in the 60s, that dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki when it wasn't necessary by any sense of the military necessity marked really the beginning of the end of a U.S. democracy. It was the nuclear weapon, at that time the atomic bomb, that impelled the creation of the National Security Act in 1947, which set up the Pentagon and CIA and National Security Council. These institutions have grown in power and scope to the point where no president can control them. Congress cannot control them. Michael Glennon at Tufts has a very good short book based on his experience in the State Department and in the Senate. It is called Double Government, and it's based on a analysis from the 19th century of British government. There was an outer government which was for the people's legitimacy, and then there was a permanent bureaucracy which was necessary, which was expert, and it was necessary to manage the globe-spanning empire and protect it from the vicissitudes of elections. And this is the system we have here as well. In Glennon's thesis, which is that these three institutions created by the National Security Act, the Trumanite institutions, as he calls them, have overshadowed the Madisonian institutions created by the Constitution. And as James Douglas put it, from the theological, his theological background, and his just historically, nuclear weapons have been incompatible with democracy, and the split that began in 1945 has ramified through the U.S. political system, and I completely take this understanding as well. And I think it was behind the decision to set other careers aside and work full time on this problem. We can't get we can't get to the political and social and economic place that we need to be in this country as long as we lionize nuclear weapons and those institutions which they spawned and which have subsequently grown to be so cancerous in our society.
Yeah, because they take over. These forces and the interests then take over and eat up the state from the inside. And at the end of the day, you're then left with a performative theater of democracy, which by now the whole world just basically understands that that's what the U.S. democratic process, at least on the top level, on the federal level, has come to. It's quite fascinating what you're saying, because Switzerland wanted a bomb, right? Back in the days, in the 60s, they were working on it. They had a heavy water reactor. The one thing that in the end convinced them to give it up was when they realized they don't even have the capacity to manage a airplane program, for the acquisition of Mirage jet fighters on the one hand, and on the other hand, that the military doctrine to never use Swiss weapons outside of Switzerland, only if attacked on our own soil. What that would mean if we had nuclear weapons, nuking ourselves, that kind of then the penny dropped, saying like, maybe these things are not as useful as we would like to think about, and gave it up, right? Are you hopeful that maybe not today, not tomorrow, but 50 years down the road, 80 years down the road, the United States too at some point might give up these weapons, just say like, it didn't work?
Yeah, it wouldn't be the United States that we know. So that's the caveat. And I keep telling people, we worked quite hard, my wife and I, on the ban treaty, the
TPNW.
Yes, Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and but the U.S. as we know it will never sign that treaty,
right?
And so not for our lifetime, and but the U.S. as we know it, you've posited a 50-year time frame here, is not going to last 50 years. Right, I do. There are, we are adding what is it, $1 trillion in new debt every 150 days or something like this. And this, of course, underlies a lot of what this president is doing. and he has to keep plates spinning, and or face a reckoning. And that reckoning is coming. It can come through economic means. It can come through environmental means. We are sitting on a ever-growing environmental catastrophe, and we are, and socially, the level of nihilism, and on the one hand, that Emmanuel Todd and others have pointed out, and the despair and futurelessness of our young people, on the other hand, are incendiary, or it's an explosive situation. People cannot expect to get married, have a house, kids. They look around and, good job might be, or yesterday's good job at least, like becoming a barista. But now you can't do that and actually live indoors and eat food in many of our cities.
Right.
In Santa Fe, where I lived for a long time, well, it's very personal. In 1972, you could rent a small, somewhat substandard, but neat and clean house for $75 a month in downtown, in immediately downtown Santa Fe, which gave you pedestrian access to everything you might possibly want. And now you may pay $1,800 a month for an efficiency apartment in a box somewhere, some distal from the center of town. You'd have to have a car. Of course, healthcare is very expensive. If you, unless you're poor enough to get Medicaid. All in all, it becomes very expensive to live. And into this mix, add 5,000 Los Alamos employees who are commuting because they can't afford to live in Los Alamos. And they are bidding up the housing market, as are the lucky few who are getting their second homes or so forth. The result is an unlivable town. And people commuting long distances. People commute, 50, 100 miles every day back and forth to work at Los Alamos now because they can't afford to live there. And there's no space to live. And there are all of these contradictions that, I lapsed into our very local situation, but nationwide, the young people don't see a future that they can reliably invest in. And people are restless. And I think there are centers of propaganda which are trying to tell them what they should be rebelling against. But underneath it, the dissatisfaction, the sense that the future is certainly not what it used to be is accurate and strong. And how long can this exactly persist?
Right. Okay. So in a sense, what you're saying here is that the work that has to be done is the preparation for the after times once this society has changed when it comes to nuclear
Yes,
weapons.
and to help it along, to birth, to do what we can as midwives and as lighthouses, if you want, for helping the transition away from violence and militarism, which have, really bled the future out of this country. At 1.5, and I guess the silver lining of Mr. Trump is that he just comes right out and said we need a $1.5 trillion defense budget. What the hell? This this can't play well, in his MAGA base. They didn't vote for a bunch more foreign wars, for they are maybe not sure how to make America great again, but they're pretty sure that I think that the bulk of them, from our informal uh, organizing, suggests that the bulk of the MAGA base is not down with what Trump is doing in foreign policy or defense policy.
Good. Then the midwifing and the maybe also the collective thinking about how to transition into the after state, because like other great powers had to transition. I mean, the Soviet Union had to transition. There was just no way around it. So it seems that we are in similar waters again. But the duty to manage a nuclear weapon state is tremendous, right? And
It is the duty, and I'm glad you used that word, because it's a word we're going to hear more of. You may know of the French philosopher Simone Weil, who de Gaulle asked to write a book about the reconstruction of France. On her first pages, she begins by saying, well, human rights we made this the foundation in 1789, but we need to think about responsibility as being a more fundamental and enduring and concept on which rights are based. And so, and we know Gandhi and others said the same thing.
One way forward for this is something that you already helped to do with the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. That's starting with those international forces that are aligned and start creating the framework, and just make it in a way that once the US is ready, it can plug in. It's just like, here,
Yes,
your seat at the table's already there. We've prepared it. We would like to have you with us, but we start building that, right? So that will be a way forward.
Yes. I want to go back to something that's immediate and which I shouldn't leave unsaid on the table.
Please.
Having to do with the expiry of New START. Right. And that is that, yes, it is difficult to make new nuclear weapons, but it is not that difficult to upload them.
What do you want?
New START limited the number of warheads on U.S. missiles.
Mm-hmm.
Or let's say that, they were more or less limited before, but New START formalized that, let's say. I don't want to give New START too much credit for disarmament. Let's say there are 3 or 4 warheads on each Trident missile on the Ohio-class submarines. They can carry up to 8, and some say, with diminished range, up to 12 W-76, the smaller diameter, smaller warheads, lighter. So the U.S. has in reserve slightly more warheads and bombs that it has deployed at the present time. The United States could deploy all those, and thus double or even more than double the number of deployed nuclear warheads in relatively short order, within, let's say, a couple of years. Something I learned yesterday, which was disturbing, and I should have known about this before, but there's too much to know. Page 52 in the PDF version of Trump's reconciliation bill of last July, the one big beautiful bill, requires that the Navy reopen 4 missile tubes on each Trident submarine, which were closed off as part of compliance with the New START treaty. Russia had complained, Ambassador Antonov, that, hey, it's, it's good that we have fewer missile tubes, but you could change them back very easily. And so now there's $62 million appropriated, which can be spent starting on March 1st, and is required to be spent under this bill to reopen these missile tubes, which would add 56 more Trident missiles to the U.S. fleet, and each one of which could carry up to 8 warheads. What the hell? So, and also there could be another 50 silos, and I'm not sure about whether or not they're all in that great shape, but there are 50 silos also extra, and enough extra Minuteman threes. So, and so basically the warheads and bombs the U.S. has in the reserve are the ones which can be deployed on relatively short notice. So we have immediate political problem of preventing uploading and expansion of force, which will certainly be seen by Russia and by China, and will stimulate them to the extent that they're not already stimulated. But I think Russia's watching very closely. That's what they've said. We're not going to do anything irresponsible. And it's the word they use. Watch this responsibly. Well, I think we in the U.S. have an immediate problem in trying to stop this. We don't want more deployed nuclear weapons.
It's so dumb because like deploying more of these just increases the risk of an accident, and it doesn't increase security a bit because at these weapons that we are talking about, they're strategic. And both Russia and China have second strike capabilities. Even if you fire all of them at them, and even if you obliterate their entire countries, they still will fire back, and Washington will burn to the ground. So it doesn't increase the actual security. All it does is make an accident more likely, not just one where they fire at somebody else, but one where one of these things blows up within the United States. But I think that's lost on many of these people, although especially the strategists, are supposed to know this.
Yes. Well, in the career and profit-oriented atmosphere of the recent so-called nuclear deterrence summit that I attended, they said that building new nuclear weapons quickly was going to signal resolve. So this business of signaling resolve applies across the board and is some kind of psycho-political mojo or something which opens doors in this country, even though it makes no strategic sense.
It's immaturity. It's the act of a puberty-ridden adolescent who thinks the world gets better by him like screaming louder.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. It's just like I had a couple of discussions in the recent past about the psychological and kind of emotional needs of some of these people who are responsible for a couple of these decisions, and also as a civilization, how you look at yourself and others and position yourself and so on. But we do need to come to an end. I'm glad that you gave me all of these very, very useful insights also about all of the hurdles that luckily this industry faces. Is there anything that you would like to add at this point that we haven't discussed yet, that's important to bring across?
I think that we understand, we need to understand that the era of U.S. hegemony is over, that the world has actually changed. And I think more people understand this than not. And so there's a sense of circling the wagons, as we might say in this country, in Washington, which we need to get inside that circle and talk to them about about the need for prudence, and not braggadocio. We have to, I think we can try to build understanding. I mean, I think citizens need to go to Russia and bring back, people need to talk to each other. We need to set up cultural exchanges. We need to do this kind of stuff, and eventually get some congresspersons soon. And they can see, the full shelves in the supermarkets and the gasoline and people going about their business, and much the same as everybody does everywhere else.
You know what we do? You know what we do? Like, since every congressman is kind of under obligation to go and travel to Tel Aviv, we just add Moscow and Beijing on the travel plan and come back over the Pacific. I mean, wouldn't that be more useful?
Yes, it sure would. It sure would.
Good. Greg, people who listen until this point, thank you very much, everybody, for sticking around. People who did, they might be very interested in more of your work. Where should they go and find you?
Sure. On the web at LASG, standing for Los Alamos Study Group .org. If you're here in this country, we would love for organizations to endorse our call for sanity on not nuclear production, which you can access at stopthebomb.org. And because we have a little movement here. And so on the website, there's more contact information.
I will put all of these links into the description box below. Everybody, stopthebomb.org, stopthebomb.org. Go and sign. Greg Mellow, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Pascal.